Hello, my name is Jenna Goddard, and I'm the Writing Center Coordinator at Thompson Rivers University, where I also teach student success courses. Today, I'm going to chat about Dr. Gregory Younging's fabulous resource for using Indigenous content in your writing. Elements of Indigenous Style, a guide for writing by and about Indigenous peoples by Gregory Younging, is a really great resource for editors and also for students and faculty, or really anybody who is using Indigenous content in their writing. I'd first like to acknowledge that Thompson Rivers University is located on the traditional lands of the Tk'emlúps te Secwépemc within Secwepemcúlecw. I'm first going to chat about how to use this resource and why it might be useful for you. And then I'll summarize some of the content that might be particularly useful for students and faculty, including Indigenous protocols, content, formatting do's and don'ts, and some terminology to avoid and to use in your writing. Gregory Younging's guide was created to be a teaching resource for anyone writing about Indigenous peoples. Although he shares 22 proposed principles that reflect best current practices, Greg really just wanted to open up a conversation about Indigenous style. And he encouraged both critique and input into future volumes. I want to be really clear that this resource was not created to replace Younging's style guide. I really encourage you to go out and get your own copy for your bookcase. Instead, it's intended to direct students and faculty towards his resource. This video summary highlights only some of the principles that might be relevant for both students and faculty writing about Indigenous peoples. Indigenous protocols are appropriate ways of using cultural material and of interacting with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. It's important to keep in mind, however, that Indigenous peoples are diverse, which means there is no single set of protocols that work for all communities. Younging's book points out general guidelines, but it's important to find out the protocols for your community. I'd like to highlight a specific Indigenous protocol around observing respect for traditional knowledge and oral traditions. First and foremost, always seek consent for using traditional knowledge. Always work in collaboration with Indigenous peoples. Never publish in breach of protocols, and never assume that any information you can obtain in the public domain has already been obtained with consent. When it comes to the content of your writing, it's important to reflect Indigenous realities as perceived by Indigenous peoples. Be truthful and insightful, and respect the cultural integrity of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous literature should not be seen as a subgroup of Canadian literature. Recognize Indigenous literature as their own canon. Recognize Indigenous identity as diverse, distinct from mainstream Canadian society, and ongoing. This means don't refer to Indigenous peoples in the past tense. Again, I'd like to emphasize the importance of collaboration. Collaborate with Indigenous peoples to ensure cultural authenticity and maintain cultural integrity. In your writing, recognize elders as authentic sources of Indigenous cultural information. Throughout his book, Younging emphasizes that building and maintaining relationships and trust is essential. Avoid inappropriate terminology, which I'll touch on in a later slide, and pay attention to names, capitalization, colloquial English, and English words of Indigenous origin. I'll also touch on that in another slide. Be very sensitive when discussing Indigenous trauma and operate by the do no more harm principle. Here are some tips for what to pay attention to and include in your formatting. I sometimes get both faculty and students asking, well, what about other citation styles like APA or CSE? You can use these styles in conjunction with Indigenous styles. Simply follow the standard style, such as APA, except where Indigenous style and the conventional style disagree. In those cases, defer to Indigenous style. Avoid inappropriate terminology, unless you are referring to a specific instance, name, or quote. As much as you can, use names for Indigenous peoples that Indigenous peoples use for themselves. Capitalization is really important in writing because it suggests something's important. So always capitalize Indigenous identities, government, social, spiritual, and religious institutions, and Indigenous collective rights. Recognize that Indigenous colloquial English is a legitimate literary device and does not need to be edited. If necessary, include a glossary in your writing when using English words of Indigenous origin. Here are a few things you really need to avoid in your writing. Be really careful with your use of apostrophes and don't use any inappropriate possessives that imply Indigenous peoples are owned by Euro-colonial states. For example, Canada's Indigenous peoples should always be avoided. Once again, information that is available in the public domain might not have been obtained with consent, so don't assume that any archival or already published materials is available for your use without permission. Never use the past tense when referring to Indigenous peoples, unless you are talking about specific activities, events, or quotes that happened in the past. Let's chat about terminology. When it comes to decolonizing our language, it's an ongoing process. Recognize that terms, names, and styles will continue to evolve. Also, take a bit of pressure off yourself and plan on not getting it right. Everybody is learning, so simply make your best effort to make informed and mindful choices about the terminology you're using. Keep in mind that Indigenous peoples have their own terms in their own languages for most of these terms. Many of these words are actually English translations, so you might want to use a glossary in your writing. Here are some examples of words that you should never include in your writing. And if you notice it in your classmates or students' writing, always point it out. Wherever possible, include traditional names of Indigenous nations. Before the arrival of Europeans, all Indigenous peoples had names to identify themselves. In most cases, it was a variation of the words the people. The work of re-establishing these traditional names is ongoing. So here's a sample of some appropriate names. It's so important that students and faculty alike work towards using and integrating Indigenous content into their writing appropriately. You can find Younging's Indigenous Style Guide in your local library or bookstore. Dr. Younging is deeply appreciated for his contributions to writing, editing, and educating. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found some of these tips useful for your own writing. Feel free to check out my other videos on academic writing and study skills.